I played Darkest Dungeon when it came out in 2016, almost 10 years ago. A Lovecraftian, D&D inspired turn-based RPG looked to be very much my thing, and I couldn't wait to get into it, especially after so many people started raving about it. But after about 4 or 5 hours, I decided that the game was absolutely not for me. I hated my time with the game. Not only did I never play it again, it soured me on roguelikes for a very long time. It left a terrible first impression. After playing Balatro recently and having an incredible time with it, I decided to dip my toe back into roguelikes again. I've been streaming on Twitch lately. Come join me, by the way, and I did a poll to see which roguelike people wanted to see me try out, and surprise, surprise, Darkest Dungeon. Great. Except, yes, great. Darkest Dungeon is great. I gave Darkest Dungeon a second chance, and I have completely turned around on it. I played through the whole game, beginning to end. I survived the Darkest Dungeon, and I loved it. Why is that? Why did I feel so strongly at first and then feel so differently the second time around? What was different? In my video on Silent Hill 2, I talked about how our interpretation of meaning can change over time and how we can see art in a different way. But it's not just our interpretation of meaning that can change, it is also our interpretation of quality. You can love something that you'd previously hated, and it often has nothing to do with the game itself. This isn't always the case, obviously. Sometimes the game is bad. Or sometimes it doesn't click with you, and it probably never will. Narrowing your taste and figuring out what you like and dislike is an important part of becoming more self-aware, but this video isn't about that. This video is about why and how you can change your mind about a video game. I'm going to talk about how first impressions are formed, how expectations affect reality, and what you can do to resist the urge to make snap judgments and keep an open mind to enjoy something for what it is, rather than what you think it might be. I'm going to tell you why some games deserve a second chance. When I was around 10 years old, I started to get really into film. My parents gave me a subscription to Empire magazine for Christmas one year, the actual print magazine, you know, in paper form. Fuck, I'm old. And I would watch literally anything that was awarded 5 stars. If someone out there thought a film was that good, I would give it the benefit of the doubt and check it out. I watched a lot of films that a 10-year-old should probably never see. I remember one night my grandma took me to the local DVD rental place, fuck, I'm old, and told me I could pick something out. I picked out Mulholland Drive. And if you know anything about Mulholland Drive, it's not something a 10-year-old should see, and also definitely not something you should see with your grandma. The film has some very graphic sex scenes. It was probably the most uncomfortable movie experience I've ever had in my life. I hated it, and I felt sick. If you watched a couple of my other videos, you'd know I absolutely love Mulholland Drive and the films of David Lynch. So what changed? Well, I mean, for one, I'm not 10 years old, and I can enjoy the comfort of watching his movies without my grandma eyeing me down and wondering where it all went wrong. Mulholland Drive was not made for the 10-year-old me. It was made for me now. All media is created with an intended audience in mind. Age demographics are incredibly important, and if you work in the industry, this is something that you'd want to make very clear to the people who are selling your work, because your intended audience are the people who should be buying it. Hello Kitty Island Adventure has a very different intended audience to Doom the Dark Ages. You can buy and like both, but they have a primary demographic in mind, and they are different. There is a Simpsons Treehouse of Horror episode where they recreate Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. And at the end of the telling, Bart shrugs his shoulders. What's so scary about a bird? Homer, though, is terrified because he gets it. It's about the finality and inevitability of death, something which he understands because he is that much closer to it. Sometimes it takes experience for us to understand what a work has to say, and that has much less to do with intelligence than it does perspective. But it's not only age that gives us a new perspective. We are always constantly changing at all times. We don't at any point settle into our groove and become the person we are meant to be and stay as that person for the rest of our lives. We're always changing. With new developments in neuroscience, this is actually observable. It is not some abstract concept of personality that is shifting. It is our actual genetic structure. We are evolving at all times. You are not the same person as you were when I first started speaking this sentence. There are also important extraneous factors to consider, completely separate from the things that make you who you are. I've talked about some of these before when discussing the psychology of gamer rage, cognitive dissonance. Sometimes you are angry not because a game is unfair, but because you had very little sleep or not enough water. A study in 2011 sought to determine the significant motivating factors in deciding the judicial rulings of an Israeli parole board. It was discovered that there was a difference in the number of favorable rulings to grant parole depending on whether or not the ruling was made before or after a lunch break. The difference was significant, 65%. The study argues that the difference is likely not due to a link between empathy and being well-fed, but instead is more likely explained as being more open-minded to changing the status quo. It is about the difference in energy required to make a change rather than keep things as they are. I think sometimes we can have that with games. Sometimes we don't really want a challenge, and a difficult game can be more frustrating than satisfying because sometimes we don't want resistance. We want to enjoy ourselves, and we want to win. And there's nothing wrong with that. Even though I do have several videos on my channel where I do challenge runs of Elden Ring, I'm not always a super hardcore sweaty gamer. I have been playing the Yakuza games a lot recently because I'm hoping to do a video on them in the future. Subscribe for that one. Thank you, baby. I typically play those games on easy because for me, a good deal of the satisfaction comes from being the coolest person in the world, suplexing chumps into guardrails, and not from gritting my teeth through tough challenges. I want to feel strong in Yakuza. I want Kazuma Kiryu to feel strong. But if I take that mentality into Elden Ring, I'm going to have a bad time. Sometimes we don't want to come home at the end of a hard day at work or school and lose, and that's normal. Sometimes a lengthy cutscene or dialogue section might be incredibly tedious if you're having trouble focusing. Horror games might not be for you during periods of high anxiety. Some things aren't made for us to enjoy at all times. They're made for people looking for a specific kind of experience. The permadeath system in Darkest Dungeon is rough. It required me to do quite a lot of grinding to make sure I always had an available party, and that takes time. I also didn't want to read excessively through text to understand all the buffs, debuffs, and diseases that were happening every turn because reading was boring. I wanted to win. I wanted to feel strong, and that's not Darkest Dungeon. I wrote off Darkest Dungeon as a bad game that was unfairly punishing and badly designed, but I didn't want to play Darkest Dungeon. I wanted to play some hypothetical other game that gave me the experience that I actually wanted. Sometimes it's not that a game is bad, it's just a game that you don't really want to play at that time, and there is a very significant difference. Perhaps you shouldn't be saying, maybe it's just not for me, and instead consider saying, maybe it's just not for me right now, because it might be something you find is actually very much for you once your expectations are closer to reality. I've talked about cognitive load before. That's the amount of bandwidth you have in your brain before you start to get all fuzzy and overwhelmed. We all have self-defense mechanisms to prevent that from happening. And one of those self-defense mechanisms is the usage of heuristics. Heuristics are mental shortcuts. They take the pressure off our brain to process each piece of information as it happens and instead take one quick look and think, I know what this is. You may see someone with glasses, a pocket protector, and a shy, hunched demeanor and immediately think, that's a nerd, a big old dorkazoid. You may be correct, but you've used a heuristic to come to that conclusion, and it's why heuristics can sometimes lead us to judge something before we've really gotten any actual information beyond a surface level analysis. I had a really negative experience with the film Parasite. A friend told me one day, you have to watch Parasite, you would love it. And then he said that the reason I'd love it is because it has a ghost in it. That's not a spoiler. There's not a ghost in it. There is a character in the film that is referred to as a ghost in a metaphorical sense, but there are no actual ghosts in Parasite. I didn't know that. And I spent the whole movie wondering when the hell it was going to phase through the wall. I thought it was going to be a horror film. And even though it was not a horror film, I was watching it as if it was one. My expectations were completely wrong, and the experience I had was pretty disappointing. I've since revisited the film, now knowing what it is and what it isn't, and had the complete opposite experience. Parasite is fantastic. Check it out. Just please don't watch it as a haunted house movie. Expectations mess with us all the time. How many times have you heard the phrase, "It's not a bad game, it's just a bad X game"? I remember one of the big examples of this was Resident Evil 4, a game which really changed up what that series was. Same with Resident Evil 7. Now, both of those games are now considered some of the best in the series, but people at the time were pretty mad. They bought a Resident Evil game. Those games weren't Resident Evil games. At least they didn't meet their specific expectations for what a Resident Evil game is. I had that with Breath of the Wild, and a big part of me still wishes they stuck with the focus on dungeons and puzzles that required one specific solution. I didn't have a great time with that game originally, and I was pretty snippy about its success because I knew that despite my unease at the direction Zelda was heading, it was definitely heading in that direction. Take it or leave it. Tears of the Kingdom is even more Breath of the Wild than Breath of the Wild, and although I hated Breath of the Wild, I loved Tears of the Kingdom. And I think a big part of that is because I knew what I was walking into. I was used to the idea of breakable weapons, and although I still don't love them, I knew how to manage them after my time with Breath of the Wild. I was also used to the idea of puzzles having a variety of solutions. Tears of the Kingdom really advanced that formula, and finding insane ways to brute force some of the puzzles in that game became really fun because I had expectations of what the game was going to be, and they were exceeded. I've since gone back to Breath of the Wild and really loved it. I will always in some ways be a Zelda boomer, but I've learned to love this new iteration and I'm excited for whatever they do next. When we rely too heavily on heuristics, we become subject to cognitive bias. You're too quick to look at something and decide for yourself what it is before looking deeper. Because of that, you are often assessing a different reality than the one you are actually presented with. You are playing the game you think you are playing rather than what it actually is. Overhype is a big contributor to this. When everyone tells you it's the best game of all time and you start it up and you sit through the hour-long cutscenes before you get to kill anything, you might be very disappointed if your perception of the best game of all time features a whole lot of killing. And that first impression can sit with you regardless of how good the killing might actually be from then on. But we do need to try to keep an open mind. Biases can, of course, be harmful. They can cause us to make bad decisions or form impressions that are unfair. Sometimes we need to push beyond our first impressions, acknowledge them, but still give the information we are presented with the benefit of the doubt, because often, not always, but often, we are very, very wrong.
I once was lost, but now I'm found.
The earliest pieces of information that are given in a sequence are often the easiest to keep in our memory. That's called the primacy effect. The most recent piece of information is also really important in the retention of memory, and that's called the recency effect, but it is the first impression that is the most important in how we form an impression, because that's when we may or may not categorize that information using heuristics and potentially succumb to bias. If you've had any experience as an actor, even in a school play, you'd know how important and nerve-wracking an audition is. It's far more nerve-wracking than most job interviews because most job interviews don't factor in what you look like, or at least they shouldn't. The truth is, most auditions are decided from the time between the actor walks into the room and opens their mouth. Often, it has very little to do with their actual acting ability and everything to do with who they are, or at least who the people on the other side of the table think they are. Physical appearance is part of it, of course, but it's deeper than that. It's the question of whether this person could be that character. Could this guy be a cold-blooded killer? Could this woman be a president? Could this dude be a big old dorkazoid? We are very quick to form impressions of people in life and in fiction, and it takes a lot to change a mind, but we do sometimes give second chances. Think of Snape. When we first read those books or watched those films, I'm sure we all thought that dude was a pretty big meanie, a real bully. Spoilers for Harry Potter, I guess. I mean, I feel like I get a pass on that, right? We know Harry Potter, right? Anyway, he's not. It turns out everything he did was for Harry, and he was a good guy, and we were all wrong about him. But is that still how you feel about Snape? Do you think he's a misunderstood hero, or is he still a little bit of a dick? We are much more likely to forgive bad behavior if it is motivated in some way by good intentions, but it is less likely when you have a level of personal investment. If someone steals $100 from you to pay for their ailing mother's hospital bills, it takes a little bit of the sting away, but you're still $100 short. When we are playing video games, especially ones that we care deeply about, it can be hard to overlook a bad first impression because it can sometimes feel very personal. The permadeath in Darkest Dungeon rubbed a lot of people, including me, the wrong way. But Red Hook Studios didn't decide to kill your characters because they want you to suffer. Well, maybe they want you to suffer, but they want you to suffer for a reason, and that reason is ultimately well-intentioned. They want you to be scared that you will die, because if you do, there are consequences. It's what makes the game a horror game. But again, it's hard to keep that in mind when you do die, and you're then stuck with the thought of grinding up a new party of characters. It is normal to feel like a game is against you, and that it wants you to fail, but it doesn't. If a game is making you feel a certain way, it can often be a helpful thing to think about why it might be doing that. That can give you a greater appreciation of the mechanics with that added motivation. There are reasons why a game or movie or book may want us to feel sad or frustrated or lost. Is it a flaw of the game, or is that just how we are meant to be feeling? A good deal of the time, it obviously isn't intentional, or at least there are mechanics that can be frustrating as a byproduct of their original intent. I found the breakable weapons pretty frustrating in Breath of the Wild. I don't think they're meant to be frustrating. I'm sure they were meant to force you to explore the open world to keep your stocks supplied, but I found it frustrating. Though I probably found it more frustrating than a person who has never played a Zelda game where weapons don't break. I had a bias, and perception is very complicated. Technical glitches are often very frustrating. They're definitely not intended, but they're often patched fairly quickly. So if it is getting in the way of your fun, it can sometimes be best to just put it aside until the problems are fixed. Not that studios should get a pass for this. Remember when games would be finished when you bought them? Remember that? That's crazy, man. It's really not okay. But it's important not to resort to snap judgments. We do need to give the benefit of the doubt and resist the urge to classify something before we've really given it a chance. It's about having an open mind, and that isn't easy, and some people will find it easier than others, but it is good practice in learning to be more open to new experiences. And I don't just mean having an open mind about a game after a poor impression, having an open mind about you. It's about being more comfortable with the fact that sometimes you can be wrong. Sometimes you can really hate a game and be completely justified in that and have a plethora of well-argued points about why something sucks, but then you play it again and find, no, actually, you were wrong. It's good. Because your perception can trick you sometimes, and sometimes you are not the bad games detective sniffing out all the bad games with your flawless deductive reasoning. Sometimes you just didn't get it. You had the wrong idea. Wrong is, of course, subjective. There is no wrong way to feel about a video game, but you can change your mind, and that's the important thing. I completely turned my nose up at roguelikes because I couldn't see the appeal in needing to play through an entire game again after you die, but I was wrong. Because the appeal is in the tension before losing a run, and in the variability each run can have. Although you do need to replay the game a lot in a roguelike, they are often very replayable, and I feel like I've unlocked this whole genre of video games now that I've allowed myself to know that they can actually be quite good. Before, I would watch a game trailer, see roguelike, and immediately close the tab. I would roll my eyes, and now I'm adding title after title to my backlog and asking friends for recommendations, and that is the joy of second chances. So have a little think about something that you hate. Something you've completely written off, a game, a series, a genre, even an entire artistic medium, and think about the circumstances in which you experienced that and compare that with the person you are now. Think about what your expectations were going in and if they were fair or accurate. Consider why something may want to make you feel a certain way and what the motivations might be. Consider the fact that you may have been wrong. Be open to that and maybe give it another try, because you might be surprised that it is your kind of game after all. Thank you again to my lovely patrons. Thank you to Bender, Wastoid, Choking on Razors, and a very special thank you to Lako and Ritini. Thanks as well to all the people you see here. Supporters on the Patreon don't just get a little thank you at the end of my video, though. They get an extra video from me every month. Recently, I did a video examining some of the other games that didn't quite make my top 10 list for 2024. I also did one giving my first impressions of Night Rain. Support from the Patreon is really what allows me to play a range of different games and devote time to write well-researched scripts, because it does take quite a bit of work, and I'm nowhere near the level of being able to do YouTube full-time or even part-time, really. At this point, it's purely a hobby, but with your support, I can devote that little bit more time to it, which makes me really happy because I love doing it, so thank you. Thank you as well, of course, to all the people on Twitch that forced me to play Darkest Dungeon. It turns out it's a pretty good game. If you want to force me to play some games, follow me on Twitch. I'm trying to do that more. Streaming on Twitch is a great way for me to connect with you guys while I'm playing games that I might like to talk about here on YouTube. We had a community challenge recently on there where the reward was to create a Discord, which I've now done. Check out the Twitch channel for the most up-to-date invite link for that. If you have no interest in live content or supporting me on the Patreon, that's just fine. Sticking around to the end of the video or liking and or subscribing is support enough. I really appreciate it. Last week we hit 10K subscribers on the channel, which is crazy. This is an absolute roller coaster. It means the world. It really does. Thank you again, and please, please have a great day.